Alright, so we're back with another Alan Wake 2 video, and this time we're testing the RTX 4060. I'll put up all the specs on the screen right now. My benchmarking system actually had a little bit of an upgrade. We changed the CPU from a 12400F to a 12600K. Not a big upgrade, but it'll just help us a little in our CPU limited scenarios, which we ran into on the 12400F, especially at 1080p. Alright, so let's just go over the settings here quickly. So currently we're at 1080p, native resolution, no upscaling. We do have these two enabled for some reason. Those will go right away. On the low preset at the moment, and we don't have any ray tracing enabled either. All right, so just before we go ahead, I'm testing here in the woods because it is actually a very demanding area. So let's just reset our numbers if I can remember the combination on this machine. All right, so I'm testing in the woods because this is very, very demanding. This is like a worst case scenario. Basically what I've seen so far. I'm not that far into the game. I've got about 3 hours, but this is definitely the most demanding area so far. The town, you get around 50% more frames per second than in the woods. So I don't want to test there and give you false hope. So this is just me giving you the worst case scenario. All right, so at 1080p on the low preset with the RTX 4060, we aren't really maintaining 60 frames per second. And I'm just having a look at my nice new shiny 12600K CPU. I actually got it for $125, which I think is a steal. It was brand new, still sealed in a box. So I had to take it. Anyway, so getting an average of around 60 frames per second here. Luckily, we can play around a little bit with the DLSS. This game's DLSS implementation seems to be pretty good. And then we've got frame generation as well. And when we used that on the 4070, it helped quite a lot. Right, so not really a locked 60 frames per second experience here. Let's move on to DLSS. I don't think we need to change much here. We'll just go down to quality, which then internally renders at 720p. I do apologize if there's some fan noise. We're going through a massive heat wave and it's extremely warm here. Let me see if I can remember the combination again. And there we go. So DLSS quality bumped our frame rate up from just below 60 to the mid 70s here, upper 70s actually. So that's pretty good, I'd say. And our 1% and 0.1% lows are pretty good as well. Now the frame time graph does look slightly inconsistent. It's really not. I mean, you wouldn't get a flat line all the time, but just moving around the camera, etc. I don't feel any stuttering. The same was true for the 4070. Very little stuttering. I think I counted 2 stutters in my all my 3 hours of playtime. So the game is pretty well optimized in that regard. It's just that the frame rate in this specific area is low because there's a lot happening here. Right, so we managed around 80 frames per second on the low preset. The game still looks okay. I mean, reflections and everything do look a little bit noisy. That actually gets cleaned up nicely when we start using ray tracing and ray reconstruction. So let's just see. I'm going to leave DLSS quality enabled and just move up on the preset. So let's try out medium. So as you can see on the low preset, there are still a few things that are on medium and some things even on high. This setting here changes pretty much nothing when it comes to performance. And also texture detail, not much. This setting actually improved our frame rate by around 10% on the 4070 when we set it to low. Unfortunately, this setting does not become available or it disappears. It gets grayed out when you enable ray reconstruction. Anyway, we'll get there. So let's just enable the medium preset here. You'll see some things even go onto the high settings here. So it's not really just medium. Some things are actually on ultra, but ray tracing is still disabled. Right, so let's just reset our numbers here. And we're getting slightly higher frame rates than what we had when we were at 1080p on the low preset. This is on the medium preset just with DLSS quality. I mean, it does dip below 60 frames per second every now and again. This is actually prime territory to enable frame generation if you do have a higher refresh rate monitor. I'd suggest not to enable frame generation if you're targeting 60 frames per second and you've got a 60 Hertz monitor to go with that, and you enable VSync to lock it to 60 frames per second. Your input latency will just be quite terrible. But what I've also seen in the 4060 or the 4070 video, sorry, is that frame generation, the input latency in this game specifically is really not that much worse when you enable frame generation, except at 4K when we enabled path tracing, I could start feeling the additional input latency, but other than that, it was pretty good. All right, so getting around, I mean, the average was 67 frames per second here. Let's aim for 69 here. I think we can do it, depending on where we actually end this benchmark run. We might have just missed it. Anyway, it doesn't really matter. So a 60 frames per second experience is pretty much guaranteed, especially seeing that this is one of the more demanding areas of the game. So you can enable frame generation here to get you close to around 100 frames per second. So let's just move this on to the high preset and then we'll start playing with frame generation. All right, so we'll just move on to the high preset here. You'll see some things go to ultra, some things go to high, some things are still stuck at medium. Doesn't really matter. These are just the presets. You can change them as much as you want. There are many settings here. Ray tracing is still disabled. So, I mean, DLSS quality is still enabled. So let's just disable DLSS quality just to show you what the performance is like natively on the high preset anyway. So we're getting around 44 frames per second here. You might be able to enable frame generation here as well to get you to 60 frames per second, although I'd rather just go down to DLSS quality and then enable frame generation. You'll just have a much smoother input, and I mean, that's just been my experience. Anyway, let's just enable DLSS here. Let's see if we can still maintain 60 frames per second on the high preset here. Right, so not a big difference between medium and high preset. I mean, it makes sense judging by the settings that actually change in the menu. Not a lot of settings, so I think we'll probably be like 10% lower. We did drop below 60 frames per second here on the medium preset as well. The game is perfectly playable at below 60 frames per second even, though I personally would like to target 60 at all times. Consoles in quality mode target 30 frames per second, which means that, I mean, the game is not really that fast paced, and 60 frames per second is not a must. I do know some people that prefer 4K 30 to 1440p 60, for example, but me personally, I don't know what happened there. Me personally, I do prefer 60 plus frames per second. The game does look pretty good even without ray tracing enabled. Remember, this is still a rasterization performance, so the ray tracing in this game is pretty intensive, but the game does look quite good, and I mean, I wouldn't mind playing like this. I don't think we should be targeting very high frame rate when we enable ray tracing on this 4060, but I mean, that's part of the testing and we'll have to do that right away. Actually, I lie. Let's just enable frame generation first. It's just a tick that you enable over there, and remember, we had around 60-ish frames per second. Let's just reset our numbers. So we went from 60 to 90 frames per second, and I mean, if you do have a 60 hertz monitor, that's not going to make a difference for you, but this is actually captured on a 165 hertz monitor, so it does make the motion fluidity a lot better, and this is definitely much preferred. I know I keep on running the same path over and over, but I'm just trying to keep the benchmark runs a little bit more consistent, but not to be wasting too much time. I'm going to be turning around right there. So I mean, getting around 95 frames per second, so frame generation is definitely doing its thing, and the input latency increase is definitely not noticeable at all. So I'm not sure what's happening there. You have to remember that NVIDIA Reflex gets enabled by default when you enable frame generation, but this is actually pretty responsive. All right, now let's move on to the ray trace test. So once again, we'll just do a baseline test at 1080p with no frame generation, no upscaling whatsoever. I think let's just go down to the medium preset, even though there's not a big difference between medium and high. So I think let's go to the low preset here, and then we'll enable ray tracing. So if you enable medium ray tracing preset here, you'll see that path tracing also gets enabled. So we'll just disable that for now. And DLSS ray reconstruction is enabled. It was also always enabled in my previous 4070 video, in case you were wondering. I did not indicate that on the screen settings, but I was just running out of space there. Anyway, so DLSS ray reconstruction, direct lighting, all that kind of stuff, just path tracing is disabled on the 1080p low preset. And if you can remember, we didn't hit 60 frames per second at 1080p on the low preset anyway, and now we pretty much halved that. Okay, so 26 frames per second. I don't know who Logan is, I don't really care. And I mean, 30 frames per second. even though some people say that 30 frames per second is fine, like, I just find it very, very choppy. Not sure if I'd ever be able to get used to it. Motion blur should be able to help. I mean, it does feel very choppy. It's just because the frame rate is so low. When you enable motion blur, it'll smooth over the choppiness when you've got a low frame rate. So that's always an option if you target 30 frames per second. Once again, turning around pretty early because this is not really a good experience for me anyway. Right, so that was it at a native. Now let's see what DLSS settings we need to use to actually get 60 frames per second here. Let's just first see what quality can do here for us. We were getting around, sorry, that thing is always in the way. I do apologize about that. We'll be using DLSS quality, which renders internally at 720p. Let's just see our frame rates. It went up by around 10 frames per second. So that's not going to happen. Let's see if we go down to performance. I'm just trying to hit 60 frames per second here at this time. Let's see what we need, and not good. We are at DLSS performance, meaning internally rendering at 540p. I mean, the reflections look pretty good, but our internal resolution is very low, 540p, and we're still not getting 60 frames per second. Would we get 60 frames per second when we go down to ultra performance? Like, this is 360p. It's been a very long while since I played at this resolution. If you remember way back when we actually played at 640 by 480. Anyway, sure, there were times when it was a lot lower than that, but maybe some of you won't remember that. Let's just reset our numbers. So DLSS Ultra Performance to get 60 frames per second on the low preset with the ray tracing set to medium, basically. There is some tearing. I do apologize about that as well. It's just the capture card is set to capture at 60 frames per second, so the tearing is actually being captured as well. It does support VRR, but if I do enable VRR on the GPU, the screen does black out every now and again. Right, so I mean, we're pretty much getting 60 frames per second, although it won't be locked. It's just that the resolution, just look at the finer details there, like the branches and the leaves and stuff. You can definitely see this is not 1080p. DLSS is trying its best to upscale to 1080p, but this is like 30% of 1080p resolution. So it's having a bit of a struggle. All right, so that's not going to happen without frame generation. So let's just get back to respectable settings actually, and then we'll enable frame generation along with ray tracing. Right, so let's just go with DLSS balanced. Yeah, I can't remember what frame rate we actually had. Yeah, so 44, 45 frames per second. I think we should be okay. I'm going to leave that screen open and just enable frame generation. Yeah, that you should be able to see still. So frame generation. Hopefully this will be able to take us from 45 to above 60 frames per second. I do think it will. It's just a question of the input latency. Right, let's just reset our numbers. Yeah. And I mean, we went from 35 to, what was that, 75. So that's pretty good. And the input latency is definitely not an issue, especially in a game like this. I mean, it's pretty slow paced, so input latency is not an issue. But even though I say that the input latency is not an issue, the input latency does not feel much increased by enabling frame generation, which is pretty strange. As I said in all my other videos, all my previous videos regarding frame generation, I always advise you to aim for at least 60 frames per second before enable frame generation, because the latency will just be too terrible if not. And in this game, that just seems to break that rule. So not terrible at all. So sure, we are on the low preset, but we do have some ray tracing enabled here and DLSS balanced, right? So not too terrible. Now let's just see what happens if we enable path tracing here. So I'm just going to enable path tracing medium here and see how it goes. Let's just reset our numbers. We might be able to get close to 60 frames per second at all times. The input latency now definitely feels a little bit more sluggish, although it's still not terrible. I'd like to see it when we actually have to shoot enemies, get into a gunfight. I'm not sure if it'll matter then, but it does seem okay. I mean, you have to take my word for it, or you have to test it for yourself. but it definitely does not feel too terrible. So 60 frames per second with path tracing at 1080p, well, 1080p output on DLSS balanced on the low preset. I mean, it's a mouthful, but 60 frames per second is definitely doable if you don't mind the lower internal resolution that DLSS balanced uses. So right, so that's it. I think it's time to move on to 1440p. All right, so we're at 1440p. Frame generation is now disabled on the low preset here and no ray tracing enabled. All right, this is once again just to get a baseline. I'm expecting around 30 frames per second, 35. Exceeding my expectations here. I mean, this game definitely does look a lot better at 1440p, especially on this monitor, but definitely not playable unless, once again, you are targeting 1440p. The low preset, once again, is not really that low. The game does look pretty good, except for the LOD popping, right? Just look at that branch there. The moment you get closer, like it just changes shape completely. Anyway, so getting 30 frames per second, not the best experience. So 1440p native is probably not an option for many of you that have an RTX 4060, but luckily there's some upscaling to the rescue. Right, so let's see what we need to do to get 60 frames per second. Yeah, I'm going to leave that open because that's not in the way anymore. It does decrease in size when you change resolution, but I think it's big enough for you to still see it. So let's go to balanced. Let's just see our frame rate there. Pretty close, I'd say. I'd say we can actually give this a shot. Okay, so 57 frames per second. DLSS balanced, I mean, seems to be the way to go for this GPU, even at 1080p when ray tracing is involved. The experience is definitely much better. It's much smoother, and motion fluidity is much improved as well. I really wouldn't mind playing the game like this. It looks pretty good. It runs pretty well. And as I said in town, you'd probably be looking at around 80 to 85 frames per second with these exact same settings. It's just a matter of how much time you actually spend in town versus how much you spend in the woods. I'd say I think you'll spend more time in the woods, and that's exactly what I'm testing here. All right, so pretty much 60 frames per second with the DLSS balanced. All right, let's see. Now that we've got 60 frames per second, what do we need to do to get ray tracing working at 60 frames per second? So I'm going to be doing exactly the same as previously. I'm just going to enable the medium preset here, but then disable path tracing. Once again, I do think this is the only setting pertaining to path tracing. I might be wrong. If I'm wrong, just correct me in the comments. Not sure if any of these actually pertain to path tracing. I mean, obviously that does, but when you disable that, this one becomes unavailable. This is the only one that actually mentions something about path tracing in the description. So anyway, let's see how many frames per second we lose by enabling ray tracing at 1440p. Yeah. And once again, we've pretty much halved our frame rate, which is not ideal, but once again, this is definitely not a 1440p GPU. Just I know it's a little bit overpriced at $300 MSRP, but the specs speak for itself. I mean, it's actually lower spec than a 3060 of last gen. It performs slightly better than the 3060. Sometimes it actually loses to the 3060, but I mean, it's definitely a GPU targeted for 1080p gaming. So 1440p, especially on a game like Alan Wake 2, we're definitely pushing it a little bit. Now, I don't know if I did actually forget to reset the numbers. That's why the 0.1% lows are so terrible. And the average frame rate says 50. Don't take that into account. This was just a test run to see how many frames we actually lose by enabling ray tracing. So let's just go and see what we need to do to get 60 frames per second. Yeah, I don't think we are going to get 60 frames per second. I mean, 480p, highly doubt it. I mean, so getting 50 frames per second. So I think we'll need to use frame generation. So let's just go back to, let's say, DLSS performance, which is at least 720p. Just want to see the base frame rate here. We are sitting at 40 frames per second, sorry. And then we'll enable DLSS frame generation and see if this works for us. So let's just reset our numbers. And I mean, we are basically getting 60 frames per second. Now, though, the input latency is noticeable. It's pretty strange. Like it feels very floaty now. Very strange. At 1080p, we didn't really feel the input latency. Even at rasterized performance, or when we weren't using ray tracing, I didn't really feel the input latency. And with the RTX 4070 at 1440p, also didn't feel the input latency unless we started enabling ray tracing at 4K. All right, so with ray tracing enabled, these are the settings that'll get you 60 frames per second. Like, not ideal, so just stick to 1080p with this GPU. But we still haven't tested path tracing, so let's go and do that right away. Let's just enable the medium preset once again, and we'll probably be in the 50s again. All right, we're not even hitting 50, and like now it feels like about a half a second delay. Let me just reset our numbers here, because this is going to get confusing. Did I reset it now? There we go. So 50 frames per second. This is not going to work, so let's just see. The only other option we have is to enable DLSS ultra performance. Yeah. Okay, so 480p internal resolution. Maybe that'll get us 60. There we go, 66 frames per second. That's exactly what you want. Now let's just see if it can maintain 60 frames per second. And now it still feels floaty, but doesn't feel like half a second delay anymore. I wouldn't play like this, just because when there's going to be the inevitable gunfight, that you probably won't be able to hit anything unless they stand still. The input latency is definitely very noticeable, which is strange. As I said, our output or final output is still 70 frames per second, same as at previous settings where the input latency didn't really feel this sluggish at all. But you can just see the game the game looks pretty good with the path tracing enabled and ray tracing enabled and all that kind of stuff. You just need to determine or make the choice whether it's worth it to you or not. All right, so that concludes our testing at 1080p and 1440p. I'm going to do one test at 4K just to show you. This game is extremely demanding. You shouldn't be playing at 4K. Just look at our VRAM usage there. We're sitting at 6.7 gigabytes, and this is on DLSS Ultra Performance. So, I mean, 4K is definitely not going to work. So I just enabled 4K native, and we're getting 5 frames per second. But that's because frame generation is still enabled and all these other things. Let me just sort this out, and we'll be right back. All right, so I managed to disable ray tracing, and you can just see in the background the textures loading. We're getting, there we go, 60 frames per second in the menu, but you can see here the FBI sign or logo hasn't loaded at all. So it's on the low preset 4K, no ray tracing, and no DLSS or frame generation. I think I said that. All right, so let's resume game. I mean, this is a less than cinematic. You can just see we're definitely running out of VRAM here. Nothing loads in. The textures on the ground aren't loading in. Right, so 8 gigabyte GPUs aren't doing 4K in this game at all. You can see our VRAM usage is 7.5 gigabytes. I mean, I'm clipping through the terrain here. It's just because nothing is loading. Okay, let's see if we can fix this with the DLSS. I mean, we might, but I don't think so. There we go. Just enabling DLSS balanced solved all our issues for us, and we are still getting 30 frames per second. But okay, no, it broke again. 4K on 8 gigs, not doable. And I do think there's supposed to be a bench here. That's why I can't walk there. I don't know if upscaling can help us not run out of VRAM here. Let's just go with ultra performance and see what happens. All right, so we dropped the VRAM usage down to 6.7 gigs. Our frame rate is 40 frames per second. And I mean, this is definitely somewhat playable. I mean, this is much better than previously for obvious reasons. But yeah, that's what I said. I'm not going to be testing 4K. Definitely avoid 4K when using an RTX 4060. All right, that's going to be it for this video. Hope you guys enjoyed it. If you did, hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, and as always, we hope to see you in the next one.